Hello everyone, as you can see by my dress as well as my crown and also this apple, I am Evil Queen Minion Michelle, and today for this Animation Friday I am going to be briefly addressing villains within animation or discuss villains that are associated with animation, whether it be through CGI, whether it be through 2D animation, whether it be through stop motion. Um, Villains within animation, I think, for some reason, I think remain the most iconic. They remain the people that we end up thinking about when we think about villains. Um, and I would consider also comic books too. We would often associate with the villains of those as well, and those are even within cartoon form at times. So, what is it about these villains that makes them unique compared to live action villains? Well, the interesting thing about animation, like I said before in regards to the scare tactics, is that you, or one of the previous minions mentioned in regards to the scare tactics, um, you can really play around with the visuals that you're given. You can make a villain look very intimidating and scary and threatening. You can give them certain features that would be very difficult to do in live animation or live action. You can really exaggerate the features that they have, and it's a lot easier to do so because you can just draw it. You can just present it in that way, and that's how sort of it comes off effectively. Now, there's also an interesting thing when it comes to animated villains. Um, they can either be very plain, because again, there's a lot of animated villains that sort of appear more like the typical live action villains that we see, but there's some that do remain to be fairly interesting for their ability to either be threatening or comedical. With a few exceptions in live action, there's really not a whole lot of villains that are as good or as well presented, I'd say, when it comes to being comical or funny or goofy, compared to animation. Because with animation, you can get away with a lot. You can do a lot of slapstick. The thing too is a lot of the times, the funny villains within animation, they sort of work off each other at times, and you'll sort of see this. For example, in Robin Hood with the Little John and the Snake, they just play off each other so well. Same with Smee and Captain Hook. They are both villains, but they sort of play off each other really well, and it gets a lot of little laughs here and there. So that's, I think, something that animation has been able to execute fairly well because, again, animation is largely built on comedy, and you can, I think, execute a villain more comedically or more effectively when it comes to trying to present comedy in animation as opposed to live action. Because when you're doing it in live action, with the few exceptions like Home Alone or maybe even Cruella de Vil within the 101 Dalmatians live action film, there's really not a whole lot that live action has done when it comes to making the villains very laughable. A lot of the times they just come off more as threatening and intimidating. And I think animation has really bridged this gap of making villains sort of funny. At the same time, they can be threatening too. But I think for some reason, the comedic aspects that animation can bring out really do reflect well onto the villains, especially when you're seeing the villains constantly fail or trying really hard but failing. And then when they finally do succeed, you're like, whoa, you're taken aback. So it again, there's a lot of dimension you can play with, and again, it allows for for the writers and the script to be, it just gives the writing more options. Either you can make the villain threatening, mysterious, or you can make him or her comical. And sometimes, again, the bridge sort of comes together at times. You'll see this sort of with Jafar, because sometimes he's very intimidating and very creepy, and then other times you just see him playing off Iago, and it's just fun to watch. So, again, there's a lot of things that animation can do that I think gets itself across effectively with the villains when it comes to targeting children in particular. But I'm sure, even though I don't think there's really a lot of villains within adult animation, it does seem like villains play an essential role for children, especially understanding where the villains are coming from. And again, that's by giving them certain traits, and I think those come off more effectively when you're able to decide whether or not you want your villain to be funny or not, or just plain intimidating. And again, this is sort of similar to the scare this other point is similar to the scare tactics that I mentioned previously. Again, you can make your villains more within animation based within fantasy. You can give them a lot of powers that are rather difficult to showcase within live action, at least effectively. And this is where there is the intimidation factor. This is where the villains sort of have their power and have their sense of threat to the audience. And I think this really comes off very effectively. It establishes what the villain is capable of. And for some reason, I think animation just has a brilliant way of doing it compared to live action, where it's just an evil guy with a weapon, or a power hungry CEO or something like that. With live action, it's a lot more based within reality. But with animation, you can get away with a lot more. And I think we've seen this a lot with the Disney villains, in particular because a lot of those stories were based more within fantasy. But we do have, I think, this sense of complexity, because even though they don't have, even though some animated films don't have a villain that has powers or anything, they still have a good effect based upon, the writing and whatnot. But I think a lot of the intimidation factor really comes from how the villains are showcased with their powers. Again, within live action, for the majority, I'd say usually side villains are just there to be the ones that the hero goes up against, and they're not really given a whole lot of personality or a whole lot of depth. But animation really, I think, has done this thing with side villains and has taken them to a level of sort of appreciation, I guess you could say. For example, Smee being the side villain in Peter Pan, the parrot, played by Gilbert Gottfried, as the sidekick to Jafar. There's a lot of these kinds of dynamics that have gone on within animation over the years. This idea of including a side villain, including a second-hand person to sort of be there. And sometimes, again, I think a lot of the time it's done for comedic purposes, there are times where I think the side villains get certain points across and do actually serve a purpose within the plot as well. So the animation, I think, has really showcased this idea of, if a hero can have a sidekick, why not a villain? And I think that's that's something that animation I think has done fairly well, and seems to do it on a sort of consistent level. Although I think we're seeing it a lot less nowadays. Um, I think it still seems to be something that's sort of present. Um, and I think it's just something that has been a reoccurrence over the years. And what sort of makes the villains unique is who sort of surrounds them. And I think having side villains is a very good idea to get the villains' motivations across, even maybe the side villains' motivations and whatnot. The interesting thing too about animation, like I was saying with sort of the scare tactics, is with villains you can make them a little bit or more or a little bit less dimensional. You can play around with as to how much depth you want to give a villain. And I think a lot of that comes through when you're able to present it to a child audience. You don't need to worry so much as to the certain. I guess you would have to pay attention to the certain motivations, but you don't have to make them so in depth to the point where we see where they're coming from, because the whole idea behind children's entertainment is to be a little bit more black and white. Yes, you can put in shades of gray in there, and I'm not saying that those aren't there, but when compared to something like that's more adult, it does make sense to make things a little bit more simplistic. And I think that really allows either the villain to be showcased as really, really evil, or with still again a little bit of dimension to him or her, or it gives them or it focuses in onto one aspect that a villain brings, and ultimately the consequences of their sort of evil. For example, Snow White I think is a perfect example, because we have a villain who we don't really largely know or don't have. Again, she's not really that interesting, but regardless of that fact, she still displays a vice of envy, and you do see with visually how that envy takes over her. And I think that's the scary aspect that the film tries to get across. And again, she's not really interesting, but again, she brings out one of the more well-known scenes of her sort of transformation. So again, and she's drawn also very effectively too. So again, the lack of dimensions I think sort of makes up, not just from a visual standpoint, but also from what sort of the villain represents, because there is sort of this representation that is put onto animated villains as what they represent, because a lot of villains are either in animation are greedy, power hungry, have some sort of vice associated with them. So again, it is a little bit more simplistic, but despite that simplicity, I think it really works, because again, it gets it across to kids a lot more effectively, and it gives kids sort of an understanding of what the villain represents. So that's kind of the whole idea behind giving more or less dimension. You can play around with it more. With adult audiences, I think there's more expectations when it comes to the villains. There's more of an idea of you're going to make your villain interesting and not as cliche, I guess you could say. But the thing is it just depends onto how the animated film executes the aspect of the villain, whether they want to go for greed or power or whatnot. Because again, there's only a limited amount that children can ultimately understand, and I think them trying to put it to the point where it's it's easy enough for them to understand, I think gets kids more invested and gets them to understand what's going on. So the last thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to the villains, in particular within animation, is that they're very memorable. These villains are villains you will see constantly. Cruella de Vil, perfect example. Ursula. These villains just remain so ingrained within our culture, I think, when it comes to entertainment. They do have this very unique way of getting across something that, again, is probably a little bit more simplistic than something like American Psycho, for example. But despite that, they still have this very engaging quality to them, and it makes them interesting to watch. Some people would even say that the villains within animation are usually better than the heroes. And although I'll say yes, there's sort of a point to that, and I sort of have to side with that team because I'm Evil Queen. I'm Evil Queen Minnie and Michelle. But it does give the audience a different understanding of the different ways into which people sort of the villains sort of play off the hero. And I think that's why the animated villains come off more effectively. They have some sort of interaction with the hero. They have some sort of stakes with the hero, and it's a lot. I think usually in animation, it's played out that the villain and the hero are sort of very intimate on a certain level. For example, Scar was the brother of Mufasa. When Ursula is showcasing to Ariel like what could possibly result from her making a deal with her, you do see how sort of intimate the villains try to get with the hero. And I think that's, again, something that makes them more threatening. Again, Jafar, for example, he works for the Sultan. So, again, they really do try to get close and intimate with the heroes. Usually in live action that can happen, but it does seem it's a lot less. I don't see it really happening all too often within live action. So I think that's something that's very interesting, and I think that's why oftentimes we remember these villains, because they just are entertaining, and they have this presence on the screen. Now, I think that's really, though, all I can say about villains within animation. I hope this was all a very educational / helpful experience for y'all. I hope you all have a pleasant Halloween with tons of candy and hopefully apples. And yes, and I think I'm going to be off now because somebody needs an apple today, and I want to make sure that they get this apple. But I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'm more than happy to answer them. But until the next minion, bye-bye.